Hello. Hi, everyone. My name is Sriram, and I was the core adjudicator for Malaysia UADC 2023. And in this motion debrief, I'll be walking you through one of the motions we set at that year's UADC, which was the quarters motion. It is an economics one, and the motion reads: This House believes that Southeast Asian economies with heavy reliance on low value manufacturing should prioritize moving up the manufacturing value chain. So before getting into the testing for this motion. Large reason that motivated us to set this motion was that it was fairly topical. Countries like Indonesia back in 2022 had already banned exports of raw nickel and bauxite, which were critical minerals they were exporting before then, in an attempt to become higher value producers and gain more leverage and bargaining power in trade negotiations. And it is a trend we thought might be applicable to other Southeast Asian countries as well, because most of them are fairly export oriented. So it's a good discussion to have on whether they should somewhat continue the current model of development, which sees them as low cost manufacturers for the rest of the world, or should they prioritize moves such as what Indonesia did and attempt to move up the value chain and add more value within their domestic processes. So, to get into what we imagine the debate to look like, I think the largest clash is on whether this is a sound economic strategy or not, i.e., what should Southeast Asian countries look to compete on? Is it broadly cost or capability? And here I want to obviously caveat by Southeast Asian countries here, we're slightly generalizing. We're referring to specific countries which have export oriented economies and are engaging in low value manufacturing. So the motion wording includes Vietnam, Indonesia as examples of the countries we're talking about in this motion. So on proposition, I think there are a few reasons for why you'd think that moving up the value chain is a sound economic strategy. The first is just that cost-based competition is a race to the bottom, and sooner or later you will get undercut. You may be the cheapest manufacturer for many companies right now, but other countries, probably in Africa, which are soon to come up, or others in South Asia, like Bangladesh, will be strong competition for you. And because this industry generally has low entry barriers, that means that it's not a sound long-term strategy for you to hang your hats on. The second is just intuitively that higher value work generally means that you generate more per capita production. That is good for your people because that means more wages. For a government, that's good because it's more tax. And in general, it is necessary for a lot of these countries to do, because otherwise you get stuck in a middle income trap, which is a way of basically a fancy way of saying that there is no pathway for your incomes to rise beyond a certain point, because your economy has stagnated and there's not much else that the people can do. So it's good for you to preemptively safeguard yourself against that. Other reasons somewhere are to suggest that you'd want to say that when you move up the ladder and you go into mid-tech fields, you're likely to get some long-term contracts. This is intuitive because the more you move up the field, the more value you're concentrating within a country. So you now know not just how to assemble semiconductors, but how to manufacture certain parts of them. That is value that is concentrated amongst the engineers in fabrication plants for semiconductors in your country. That incentivizes more long-term contracts to be set up with domestic companies. We saw this in Malaysia for back-end semiconductor manufacturing. More countries likely to follow. Finally, I think, as I somewhat mentioned earlier, it's just that case that when you have more complex production, it gives you more leverage over any negotiations and trade that you end up doing. You also have the ability to subsidize some local champions. So these are domestic companies which are now able to produce higher value goods for export for the rest of the world, much like what South Korea did back in like the late 90s with incentivizing state-run companies to export for the rest of the world. Opposition on this clash, we imagine, would say some amongst the following. So first is the idea that you'd want to first defend why Southeast Asia is ideally situated to do a lot of the low-cost manufacturing that the rest of the world needs. So large reasons could look like Southeast Asia having a high semi-skilled population, just generally high population in general, which translates to a labor force that can work in factories. They have reasonable political stability, especially compared to the countries which are in their shadows, like Bangladesh or a lot of countries in Africa. They're also proximate to a lot of trade routes. Around 40% of global trade flows through the South China Sea and the Malacca Strait. And more reasons like this to suggest that the Southeast Asia is not just one of the low cost manufacturers; it is the preferred low cost manufacturer for a lot of companies, and that is why this is something you should likely capitalize going into the long run. But the second is to more intuitively argue that the comparative advantage of these countries has not changed, even if there may be some changes in the global economic landscape. These countries still have cheap labor compared to the average living cost standards in most developed countries. They also have low regulatory barriers and risks, which means that they should capitalize on these advantages before demographic dividends run out and you start having an aging population. The third is to suggest that moving up the ladder, which is specializing more into high value manufacturing, pits you against some industrial powerhouses who will outcompete you in this battle. This looks like industrial towns in Germany or a lot of companies who prefer to do manufacturing in the US. You don't want to compete with those companies because they have more expertise and deeper pockets to back their domestic manufacturing. And finally, you'd want to question proposition on whether whether just moving up the ladder really means anything in terms of skills or value, because presumably a lot of the manufacturing that you end up doing, even if at a slightly higher end, is governed by intellectual property and contracts which MNCs retain for themselves. So you're still on the factory line. It's just that you're doing slightly fancier work than before. That doesn't translate to meaningful value added to your population. So this is the first large clash on what sort of model of development do we want Southeast Asian countries to follow. The second, which sort of follows roughly from the first, and I think it's a large clash in any economics debate, is on what is the likely effect of this policy on jobs and the workforce in general. So proposition claims are fairly simple here. So higher skilled jobs are less replaceable because your workers have more training and they also have more skills which are portable across industries. If you know how to manufacture certain parts of a semiconductor, you can probably cross apply those learnings in other slightly high skilled manufacturing jobs. Second is that you have to make this transition because an upskilling of a labor force is just more adaptable going into the long run. At some point you will have to reskill your manufacturing base. Might as well do it. And and you want to say that generally running a bunch of sweatshops isn't a sustainable model for development. It's not aspirational, and you want to provide your people with better quality jobs, and this is a pathway to doing that. On opposition, you question how many jobs this creates, because obviously capital intensive manufacturing requires few jobs per dollar or per whatever unit of currency invested. And it also means that getting to that end state of manufacturing well requires mass retraining, which is an uncertain payoff at best. By that, what I mean is it is unsure whether you will need these skills 5 years down the line, or you've just thrown a bunch of money running training programs for skills that will end up being obsolete. Do note this motion was set in 2023, where AI was a thing, but not as pervasive as we see in the news around us every day. So yeah, transitioning workers is a difficult task, and any skill programs that are run that may not be very well designed, just lead to a situation where you've thrown a bunch of money down the drain and could lead to unemployment, underemployment. So yeah, that is the large clash on jobs and what kind of jobs you broadly want. Then there's a third, and I think interesting clash on the timing of the move, because the note here is that opposition in this debate doesn't have to support doing nothing. They are well within their rights to say that such a transition may happen somewhere down the line in the future. The burden on proposition is to support an immediate and concerted effort towards transitioning economies away. And the clash here goes somewhat as follows. On proposition, you want to make the threats of automation sort of inevitable. So the comparative advantages that you enjoy right now, which is labor arbitrage, will go away sooner than later. And for many reasons, it is better to act early than to be forced into a crisis. Because when you act early, you can plan more. These shifts are less disruptive than when you are responding to a jobs crisis or populist backlash. Second is the idea that like you will the China plus one opportunity is fairly real for most countries. So companies across the world are looking for stable countries where the risk of political or regulatory shocks is low. And many Southeast Asian countries fit this bill well. They are part of trade agreements like the RCEP, ASEAN, etc., which means that the cost of like ease of doing business is fairly high. And for the reasons we suggested earlier, like these countries should look to capitalize on the China plus one opportunity to gain like more leverage from their economic operations. On opposition, I think you'd want to question whether these high value investments that you end up doing right now have a clear return on investment, because there is no guarantee that the target, like sectors that you target, will end up staying valuable. So you may want to make like solar panels, you may want to manufacture batteries for electric vehicles, but not really certain whether these forms of manufacturing will stay within your country or not. And then is the claim that we simply do not have enough signals right now on what industries we should transition towards, what forms of manufacturing we should pivot our economies towards. And low end manufacturing allows you to be more agile because you've not put in a lot of sunk cost into training your workforce, which means when you have a reasonable enough signal that you must transition, you can do that much faster and better because you've not put in a lot of like eggs in the same basket earlier. And then I think more saliently, you'd want to question whether doing it right now will even get you enough jobs, because there is an ongoing trend towards onshoring of jobs or nearshoring of jobs by developed economies. And this is especially true for high value sectors. These are industries that are quite well protected and are unlikely to be outsourced, especially to developing economies. So it is the case that the industries that you're trying to enter into may not have the jobs for Southeast Asian economies in the first place. So it is questionable to do the move right now. So yeah, these are some of the thoughts that we had while setting this motion. Obviously, this is not an exhaustive set of all arguments that can be run in the debate, and evidenced by the debates we saw at that year's UADC, teams were a lot more imaginative and creative in running arguments. I hope this was helpful, and all the best for this year's UADC.